So before we get into the content for today, let me show you, like, let me share two quick updates with you. So the very first thing that you should know is that the GitHub repository has been updated as always. And I've added the recordings of all previous sessions. So all the way from, after the introductory session. So sessions 2 through 5, all recordings have been added. And the code has also been updated. I will rename this to session 5. By mistake, I mentioned session 6 here. So today is session 6. So I'll just rename that. And the code is also available, right? So if you just open this one, you can see the code from our previous session, which was our DOM session for JavaScript, right? So you can see I already updated it that day itself, right? 3 days ago. So I am trying to upload it immediately after the session itself so that you can get access to the code the very same day. Okay. And I've also updated the recordings as well. So you can find all previous recordings here. And I will keep updating this as well, as and when we have more sessions. So that's an update on the GitHub repository. Everything here is up to date. Now, coming to today's agenda or today's topic. So what we are going to do is we are going to, so today is going to be our, think of it like a bridge between front end and back end, right? So we are going to discuss some concepts like API, JSON data, which are going to help us send requests from the front end and connect to the back end, right? So we are still talking about JavaScript today. And from the next session onwards, we'll start our backend discussion with Python. But for today, we are still talking about how do we actually connect a front end to a backend. So for today, we will deal with, or we will use some already available APIs that are available for free on the internet, but we will then create our own custom APIs when we get to the backend aspects, right? So again, we'll discuss the basics first, and then in the last 3 sessions or so, we'll put it all together into a project. So that's our plan. We have been following that for the past couple of sessions. So that's the same plan that we'll continue with as well, right? So yes, so today's session is going to be a bridge between the front end and back end. But before we get to the concepts, I have a couple of quick questions for you. Now, these are multiple choice questions based on the concepts we have covered in the previous session. So I'll just share the questions on the screen one by one. You can take a minute, read it, and put the correct answer in the chat. You can just mention 1, 2, 3, 4, whichever you think is the correct answer, right? So here is the first question on the screen for you. So the question is, which method is used to select an element by its ID in JavaScript? You have 4 options on the screen. Read them very carefully and then put whatever you think is the correct answer in the chat. I'll give you about a minute for this. Again, we'll discuss the correct answer and move to the next question. So again, read the question and start putting your answers in the chat. Okay, perfect. So the correct answer is option 3, right? So almost all of you have got this one right. The correct answer is get element by ID, which is option 3. Here's the next question. So again, read it very carefully, think about it, and put the answer in the chat. All right, perfect. So the correct answer is option 1, right? Inner HTML, that's the property. We have other properties also. We have something called inner text, as well, and we have seen the differences between the two. So that's what we have. Perfect. Here's the third and the final question for now. So again, read it and put the correct answer in the chat. Okay, great. So yes, the correct answer here is option two, right? Which is append will add a new child element to the end of the parent. So we have seen this again. Whenever we create a new element in JavaScript, we use append child to add it to the end of the body in HTML or wherever else we want to add it on the screen, right? So yes, that's what we have in terms of the revision quiz kind of a thing that I planned for today. Now with that, let us jump to our very first concept for today. And I will take a few minutes to explain this in detail because this is a very, very important concept and we will be using it a lot, right? Every single day, whenever we are dealing with any kind of a web application, we are using the concept of API or application programming interface almost on a daily basis. So it's really, really important for us to understand what an API exactly is and how it basically works. So let me walk you through it once properly in terms of the theoretical explanation and understanding, and I'll show you a couple of examples as well. And then we will see how we can actually connect to this API using JavaScript, right? So the most important thing again is the full form. So whenever we deal with technologies, in most cases, if it's an abbreviation or an acronym, then the full form actually mostly tells us what the thing is about. For example, I explained to you that CSS is literally what the full form tells us, or HTML is also, what the full form of HTML tells us. That is exactly what HTML does. So in a similar way, right, we have API, which is an application programming interface. And very simply put, what an API does is it lets two applications talk to each other, right? So let us say that you want to integrate, say, login with Google in your application, or you want to integrate login with Facebook or anything like that into your application, right? For this, you will obviously have to somehow talk to Google's app or Google server in order to get that functionality. And obviously, Google is not going to give you their code. They're not going to be like, okay, here's our code. Why don't you integrate it? And that's not how it works. So instead, what we do is we connect to, or rather, the Google's team will give us what is known as an API. So they will give us an API. In this particular case, the authentication API that Google provides, which we can use. Can anybody tell me what is the name of this API if you know about this? So there's an API which is used to connect all our social logins. There's a particular word for it. Do you know what that word is? Let me know in the chat if you do. Otherwise, of course, I'll tell you. But if you know already, do let me know in the chat. It's not relationship. It's not, no. Postman is a tool. It's not that. Okay, no worries. So the word is OAuth. Okay, so I'll type it in the chat also. It's called OAuth. And OAuth basically is open authentication. That's basically what that means. And so yes, I have put this in the chat also. It's called OAuth, which is open authentication, where we have all kinds of social logins. So login with Google, login with Facebook, login with Twitter X now, login with GitHub, login with Microsoft, login with Apple. All of these different social logins are available through this API called OAuth API, right? So basically what happens is companies like Google or Facebook or any of these companies, they will provide us with an API. And what we have to do is we have to connect to that API. So there are two problems or two issues that we typically face, right? Number one, obviously, is that we cannot get access to their code directly. Like obviously, code is proprietary information in terms of law. It's IP, intellectual property, right? Companies literally make billions of dollars through software, through code. So obviously, they're not going to share it. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge when it comes to API is the sheer choice of the backend technology, right? Like we discussed in the very first session, in the very beginning, I told you that for front end we don't really have a choice. We can only use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because the browser only understands these languages. That's it. But for the back end, we can technically use any programming language. Theoretically speaking, we can even use C, C++, Java, JavaScript, Python, PHP, Ruby. There are so many other languages that can be used for backend. So we have no idea what backend Google is using. Right? There is no documentation. There is nothing publicly available for it. And obviously, you can't get access to the code as well. So that's the second challenge. How do you bridge the gap between two different languages? You might be using JavaScript. Maybe the other website is using Java or PHP. Who knows? So how can a JavaScript code or how can a Python code connect to a Java code? Or how can a Python code understand PHP code? Right? That's the second biggest challenge when it comes to APIs. So again, two major challenges. Number one, we can't see the code obviously. And number two, we don't know what language is being used to write the code. So after a couple of years in experimentation and a lot of research and all of that, people came up with solutions, and API is one of those solutions, right? So let me give you a very simple example from a daily life, so that you understand how this actually works, and then we'll get into the technical details. So this is also a very standard question that is asked in interviews, like what is an API, how does it work, all of that. So listen very carefully. It's a very interesting setup and very simple as well. So here's how it goes. Let us assume that you want to buy a 10 rupee chocolate. Okay. Let us assume that you want to buy a 10 rupee chocolate from a shop and you have a 10 rupee pen with you. You have a 10 rupee pen with you and you want to buy a 10 rupee chocolate. So you go to a shop, and you offer a 10 rupee pen in return for a 10 rupee chocolate, right? Obviously, the shopkeeper is going to laugh at you and throw you out of the shop, right? Because they are not going to accept a pen for a chocolate. That's not how it works. So, in the exact same way, assume that our code is written in Python and their code is written in PHP, and we are going to them saying, take this code and give me your code. Obviously, it's not going to work. There is no mutual agreement, there is no common understanding. So how do we solve this in real world? We solve it with currency. We solve it with money, right? So what we have done is we have made a third party thing. We have made a third item called money, which we can use. So if you have a 10 rupee note that you offer the shopkeeper, they're going to give you the 10 rupee chocolate without any complaints. In the exact same way, that is exactly what API does. So what we do is we provide our data to Google. Let us assume that we are implementing Google login just to keep a consistent example. So let us assume that we want to integrate Google login. What we do is it's the exact same thing like buying a 10 rupee chocolate. What we do is we take our data, just like we take a 10 rupee note, and we hand it over to the shopkeeper. So in this case, we will hand it over to the Google server, right? So we will hand our data over to Google server. And just like the shopkeeper, they will go back, they will search for the chocolate and they will give it to us. So in the exact same way, Google's server is going to process your information, understand what you want, and give you the respective details. So in this case, if you want to incorporate Google login, then it will take the user to Google login, take their email password, and once they log in successfully, the Google server will return their details to us, saying that, okay, we have verified this user for you. Here are the details. You can proceed further. So that is what an API is. It is a point of communication between different applications. Does that make sense? Is this clear? It's a way for different applications to talk to each other, communicate with each other. Right? That's what an API is. So the best part about an API is that it is language independent, or it is technologically independent, right? So what I mean by that is, no matter what backend you are using, no matter what backend Google is using, or any other server is using, these applications are still able to talk to each other because of this API. Okay, so that's what an API is. It's an interaction medium for two different web applications to talk to each other, right? Now, what is the role of the API? Where does this fit in? Where, let me show you. So what we have here is our front end, right? This is our user facing application. So let us say that, we have a form here and we want to read the user details from the form. And then we want to show a welcome screen like, hi user. We want to show something like this to the user, where obviously we want some dynamic data to come in. So the API will sit between our front end and our back end. So now assume that this is our back end. This is our database and our backend. So what the API will do is, when we send this request, when we want to connect front end to the backend, we will send a request to the API. The API will connect to the backend or the database. The processing will happen here. The data will come back to the API, and from there it will come back to us on the screen. So that is the job of an API. If I give you another real world example, API is exactly what a waiter does when you go to a restaurant, right? Let us say that we go to have food at a restaurant. Now, in the restaurant, the seating area where we sit and have the food, that is the front end. The kitchen is the back end, right? So that's where all the cooking is happening, all the processing is happening. And the waiter is your only link between front end and back end. So when you enter the restaurant, the waiter will come to you with a menu. The waiter will understand what you want. The waiter will go and communicate it to the kitchen. So they will explain to the kitchen what is needed. The kitchen will then process your, like, cook your food, get all of that done. And the waiter will then get the food over to you. So this role that the waiter is playing as an intermediary between the front end and the back end is exactly what an API does. The API is our mediator, is our communicator between the front end and the back end. Right? I can't give you a simpler example. I hope this makes sense. Now, how does this actually work? Well, that's where things get interesting. So what we do is, we have a very interesting technology. It's not exactly a new technology, but we have a very interesting data format. And what I'm about to show you is just one example. There are a couple of such formats that exist. So this format can be thought of as the currency. So again, remember our chocolate example. You give a 10 rupee note, get a 10 rupee chocolate. So that 10 rupee note is a common identity or something common, right? That both you and the shopkeeper recognize. Both of you agree that this is 10 rupees. So in the exact same way, in the case of an API, what happens is the JSON data is basically a format. I'll show you an example in just a minute. This is a special data format. Just like we have text data, we have number data, we have document, PDF, in all those different like images, they are all different formats of data. So in a similar way, JSON is another data format, which is going to be a common data format for the API transmission. So again, think of this like an item in the menu of a restaurant. When you say that you want, let us say, pasta from the menu, the waiter understands that pasta is needed, and the kitchen also knows what pasta means. So your front end and your back end both agree on that common thing, right? That you've mentioned that pasta is an item available. I want pasta. The kitchen will be like, okay, I understood that they want pasta. So in the exact same way, when we want to, let's say, log in with Google, we want to provide that feature, we will have to send data to Google in the JSON format. Google will process the data and send it back to us again in the JSON format. So what happens here is, in this case, it's actually really simple. So let us say that our backend is written in Python. Okay. And assume, again, just an assumption, that Google's backend is written in PHP. The JSON data that we provide is independent of the programming language. Okay. The JSON data that we have is independent of the programming language. So whenever we want to send some data from our application, We first convert it to the JSON format. So we convert it to JSON format, and that data is sent to Google. Then Google will convert it back to whichever language they want. So they will convert it back to PHP style data or PHP format data, get it done. And then again, they will convert it back to JSON and send it back to us. And then once we receive data, we can again convert that data into what Python can understand and process it that way. So this is just an intermediary data format or a data format for transmission of data or transfer of data. We don't really process JSON data. We only use it as a standard convention, a standard pattern for transferring data. Right? Does that make sense? Are all of you on the same page so far? I will take questions in just a minute. I just want to know if you've understood the basic concepts of API and JSON. So just let me know if it's clear. Yes, clear. No, not clear. Something like that. And then I'll answer all your questions. No problem. Okay. All right, great. So let me quickly repeat it once again, just to be very sure. So API and JSON are, first of all, obviously very different things. Otherwise, there would be no need for them to be named differently. API is the process where your application is communicating to the backend. So our front end is communicating to our backend, or two different applications are talking to each other. That's API, right? For example, when the waiter takes your order and gives it to the kitchen, takes the cooked order from the kitchen, gives it to you. That is API, right? So that waiter is behaving as the mediator. That is the API. The order or the common understanding where you say that I want pasta and they cook pasta, or you have currency like you give 10 rupees, the shopkeeper agrees it's 10 rupees. That is JSON. So JSON, you can think of it like the data that is being sent is JSON data. Right? So whenever you want to talk to each other or communicate, obviously there is some data which needs to be sent. Right? Like you need to tell Google that this is the username or this is the Gmail ID that they want to log in with. So you have to provide that data. And after that, Google will process it and they will tell you true, success. This is valid email, for example. So that response will come from Google that this is a valid email. That will also be in some data, some sort of data, right? Google will tell you that there is some data. So this is JSON. Now, JSON is one of the options, right? There are other options also available. Like I said, JSON is one of the options. We also have something called XML, right? So there is XML, which is another data format. It's called extensible markup language. I'm not getting into it, but that's another alternative to JSON data, right? And similarly, we have something called CSV. That's comma separated values. This is very commonly used in data analytics. So when you go to Python, when you go to the AIML analytics part, you will see data being sent in CSV format, right? So these are some other formats that are used. But in our case, in most web applications between for communication in API, we use JSON data. Right? So JSON is the most popular. And again, there are alternatives like XML, CSV, etc. But JSON by far is the most popular one, right? So now let us take some examples or some questions that you might have. So I am scrolling in the chat. There were 2, 3, 4 questions that I will take. But in case I have missed out on those, do put them again in the chat. There were 2, 3, 4 questions that I'll quickly take up because it's very important that you understand these concepts, from a theoretical level first, so that we can then write the code for it in the session as well. How to track user login info. So this is Pawan Sai is asking how to track user login information by using API. So that is exactly where JSON comes in, right? So JSON is something like this. Let me quickly show you a sample a JSON document, what that looks like. So hopefully you will understand it better. Uh, right. So a sample JSON data looks like this. Let us say email hello@gmail.com. It's basically a comma separated list of, just like we have a MongoDB or any other storage, key value pairs. So we have a key, for example, email is the key, this is the value. and we can have first name. This is the key, right? Let us say that John is the value. Then we have, for example, say last name. So this is the key, right? And then let us say that we put Doe. This is the value. So this is how JSON data looks like. So no matter which programming language we are using or whatever backend we are using, this JSON data that we have can be understood by every single language. Right? Just this JSON data can be understood by almost all programming languages, all the way from C, C++ to more modern languages like Python. So all languages can convert to and from JSON. So that's how JSON works. So whenever we want to provide any information or receive any response, we will use this kind of a format, JSON format. That's what this looks like. Again, we will take more detailed examples when we write the code. All right. Now let me just take the remaining questions as well. So there were two questions left. Who can use an API? Good question. So there are three use cases for an API. Number one, a front end, the front end of an application can use an API to interact with the backend, right? The front to interact with their own backend. For example, let us say that you want to display order history. You have an e-commerce website and your user wants to see order history. So you will connect to your orders API. You will fetch the data from the database and show it. So in this case, your front end is connecting to your own backend. The second use case is where your front end can connect to somebody else's backend. For example, in case of Google login, right, our front end will connect to Google's backend to get some functionality done. The third case is where there is no front end involved. There is automatic backend to backend communication. For example, let us say that we're talking about recurring payments, right? So when you want to auto debit something from the user, it's a subscription model and they have added a credit card or something like that, and you want to automatically debit every fixed day every month. That is automatic. Neither you trigger it nor the user will trigger it. So that's a backend to backend communication where your backend will automatically connect to the bank's backend and try to debit the amount, and that entire transaction will take place. So these are three different places or three different modes in which an API can be used. Okay, so this is Mohammed Jafar. No, JSON is not an API. JSON, you can think of it, is the tool that is used to implement API. Right? JSON is a way of transferring data. It's just like a PDF file or an Excel file or a Word file. It's a special data format used for communication um, between like whatever front end, back end when working with an API. Is JDBC coming under API? No. So Sunil, JDBC is basically Java database connectivity, and that's between your backend and database. There is no front end associated with JDBC. For an API, so yes, I mean it's a separate thing altogether. It's not got anything to do with the API as such. Okay, okay. So this is Vallabhneni. Okay. Other than API, is there any other thing used for communication front end with backend? No. The only way to communicate between front end and backend in today's setup, like in 2024, is API. And that's the standard that has been established. So this is the only way to communicate. XML is also communication from front end to backend. No. So Pujita, and for everybody else, XML, JSON are data formats. They are not API. XML is not API. JSON is not API. They are tools or data formats used for implementing API. The communication that is happening, that communication is called API. And the data that is being sent for this communication is being sent either in JSON format or in XML format. So JSON is not API, XML is not API. They are just data formats to transfer data during API communication. So very different things. JSON full form. Okay, so JSON is JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. The reason why it's called JavaScript Object Notation is because it resembles the way JavaScript works with objects. So again, that's what we are going to discuss when we write the code today. So it's coming up in some time. Yes, I'm going to show you examples. Don't worry. Um, Yes, I will show you some free APIs as well. So there are some platforms that give you free API access. But yes, so that's the setup, right? So JSON is not a framework. It's just a format of data. Just like we have text file, PDF file, image file, just like that, we have JSON file, right? We save it with .json, just like we store .txt, .doc, .pdf. Just like that, we have .json, .json. That's it, right? It's just a special data format. Okay. Yes. So we will see API creation in backend. So that will come in later. For now, we will see how to connect to an existing API from our front end, because we are currently discussing front end. But yes, so the next step will be to create our own APIs using Django. So that's the backend which will come in later. Uh, Yes. Okay. So now let me show you a couple of examples of this, and then we'll take more questions later on. So I'll just pull up the folder and just give me 1 minute. Uh, so, Session 5. And then this one is session 6. So I'm just creating a new folder and opening it. Okay, done. Now, what we will do is I'll first show you a few examples of APIs on the internet, right? So that we know what they are used for, what are some potential use cases, and then we'll try to implement some of them in code. So I have 2, 3 mini project ideas, and we'll see how much we are able to implement, but I will try to show you 2 to 3 different examples where we have one simple example, one where we send some data, stuff like that. So let's try to do it one by one. Okay. First up, let us go ahead and take a look at the examples of some APIs, and then we'll see what we can do to get the data from there. Okay. So the very first example that I want to show you, it's a really important tool that you will use later also, is called random user.me. Okay. So this random user API is basically a random user generator. And what it basically does is, you can see here, there are some user details which are all random. So there is a username, we get email, birthday, address, phone number, password. And when I refresh this, you will see the details will change. So on every refresh, this random data will change, right? So it's a very important API, because obviously it is not going to be the case that if you want to test your application, let's say with 1,000 active users, to see the load it can take and all of that, you are not going to sit and create 1,000 users manually, right? Instead, what you can do is you can connect to this API and get data for 1,000 users within a second, within seconds, right? So that is this API. It's a free API. All of these are random AI generated images, and these are not real people. It's all random data. So yes, it's a very handy tool or a very handy API whenever we want to get some user data. Let us say that you want to experiment with how an actual user looks like. So you don't have to sit and create data on your own. You can use this API, for instance. Right now, how does this work? Well, we can check out the documentation. So if I click on documentation, you can see it gives us several different options. We can say how to use, and then you can see here it is giving us some different examples and etc etc. You can read it later. I don't really want to read it now, but the URL, which is what we also call the API endpoint, is this randomuser.me/API. Now, as soon as we connect to this endpoint, we get this result or we get this response, and this is JSON data. Okay, this is what JSON data looks like. Now, what I will do is I will actually let me see if I have that extension enabled. So if I do have it, I will show it to you. It's an extension called JSON tree. I am not sure. I think I have it in Chrome. Let me just check that out. Okay, my bad. Yes, so here it is. So I have an extension which is, so there is no API key needed for this API. Some APIs like Google Maps or other APIs which will charge you, based on the number of usage and all, they will want you to create an account, get a key. But this is a free API, so we don't need to get any key for it. We can directly connect to this URL, randomuser.me/API. Okay. Now I have an extension installed in Chrome, which I think is I forgot the name of that extension, but yes. So there is this pretty print which you can see, which I enable. So this shows us the data in a formatted manner, a better manner. But if you don't enable it, then this is what the actual output looks like. Right? So it's just a better way to see the data. We are not actually changing anything. So you can see here we get gender, name, so first name, last name, title. Then we get the location, we get city, state, country. We get email address, we get the login details like user ID, username, password. We get the date of birth, registration date, cell number, phone number, image, large image, small image, etc. Right? So we get a bunch of this information, and every time we reload it, it will change. You can see now this is Mrs. I think it's Mehezash, whatever. But if I refresh it, then you will get Joe Lord, then we get Gabriel, we get Andre Silva. So every refresh, we get a different data. Okay. So this is one example of an API which is a free API, and we don't have to create an account for it. Right. On the other hand, there are other APIs. For example, we have the Google Maps API, which is used by platforms like Uber, Ola, and all of these ride apps to show you the directions, how far the rider is, your path, and all. All of them use something like this. Maybe not Google Maps, but a map API, right? So this is an API which will require you to have a valid Gmail account and a credit card. So you have to upload a credit card. You can see the pricing section. So you can see here, we will say 200 usage every month for free. So up to $200 for free. And they will give you some things like, however, like what kind of requests you get, etc., etc. And based on that, they will calculate a pricing for you. But the point is, this is a paid API. Right? This is a paid API. So to use a paid API, you have to create an account. You have to add a credit card to it, and then you will get an API key. So if I just show you the API in this case, let me find a script if I can. Um, Let me just see if we can get access to a URL. Yes, there you go. So in your script, you can see this is a JavaScript tag, and here it is telling us to add our key. Okay, so we have to basically copy this code into our HTML file where we can implement this. And here we have to replace it with our API key. Right? So this is a paid API where you have to, which is chargeable. Right? So typically it's a free API for about 1,000 requests or so. But for every request after that, they will charge. Right? So that's another example. Then there is something called Open Weather Map. This is another paid API, right, which is again available for weather data. So this will show you the current weather. So for example, if I just say allow this time, then it will load data for my city. Right? If I just reload it, or we can just search for a city. So what this will do is it will try to load the data for that city. So I am currently in Nagpur. You can see the data, right? So 26 degrees Celsius, it shows us everything, right? 8-day forecast, hourly forecast, humidity, etc., etc. And we have a bunch of other data that they provide as well, right? So you can see we have so many things: historic weather, daily forecast, and other things like the UV ray data and solar data and everything. So if you just check out their API, you will see everything. And they have so many different things available. And they've also mentioned format. So this is available in JSON and XML. This is available in JSON and XML. This is available only in JSON. So even if XML is missing, you will see JSON will always be there. So this is CSV and JSON, right? So JSON will always be there. So again, you can see some solar data available, right? Then there is some fire data, air pollution index, geocoding, UV index, everything. So this API is used by almost every single app which shows you weather. So even Apple's weather app or the Windows weather app, where you see those weather tiles, in the start menu, most of them fetch their data from one of these APIs, right? So even if you want to, let's say, create an application which allows users to get access to an API or show weather, you will then have to use one of these APIs, because obviously you are not going to you are not going to set up physical equipment to measure the weather yourself. So you can use leverage existing APIs like these. So you just have to provide your coordinates and they will give you the exact data that you need. And naturally, since it is using some hardware like satellite and all, it is paid. So you have to pay for it because obviously it requires a lot of sophisticated hardware, right? So that's the setup. That's an API. I have shown you free example. I have also shown you paid example. Now there's another very important free API called JSON placeholder. Okay. So again, I am giving this link in the chat. It's a very good API for a lot of different things. So it contains data for a bunch of different things that you can see. It contains some posts, some comments, some albums, photos, to-do list, random user data, right? So this also contains a bunch of different things. If I click on photos, you can see these are URLs and they will work. So if I just try to open one of these photos up, it will show up. It's been stored somewhere on the internet on some drive, which we can access, right? So these again are free APIs. So that's the setup. Okay. Free APIs. So it's a very good question. Venkat is asking, are free APIs secure? Well, as long as you don't send any data, it's all good, right? The security compromise will come in when you want to send some private data. So obviously avoid that. We are not, these APIs are not asking for any data. They are just returning something. So when they ask for something from you, that's where we could have a security risk. So be very careful with how you work with these, but these are trusted APIs because they've been around for a very long time and I've used them for years now, right? So random user and JSON placeholder are really good free APIs for different kinds of JSON data. And again, you can see the code also. We'll use this exact code to get API data. I'll show you that as well. But yes, so these are some good resources for you, right? And then we have also paid examples like Open Weather Map, Google Maps, etc. So Open Weather is weather information. Google Maps is like route data, mapping data, distance data, all of that stuff that we typically see on a map in Google. It also contains stored listings, etc., etc., etc. Right? So that's the idea. So Pawan, we don't really need an API to create a custom avatar. I'm sure there are APIs available for it, but we typically implement it as a functionality. But yes, I'm pretty sure there must be APIs available for it. You can just Google for it, look for it, and I'm sure you'll find something. But normally what we do is if the user is not uploading a profile picture, then we just generate a random background color and use their initials, kind of like what Gmail does, so like a random background with A. In my case, it would be because my name is starting with A. So we generate that within the functionality. For such a small thing, we don't really use an API. But yes, if you want like a custom image creation, then I'm sure there are APIs available for it. Okay, perfect. So these APIs are going to be like extensions, add-ons to our application. Okay. So now let me show you one example of using an API to fetch data. Okay. So let me create two things. I'll create an index.html and we'll create all our standard things. So style CSS, scripts.js, and I'll quickly establish all the connections. So this is a template. Let's call it API examples. That's my app name. And then view word wrap. Okay. And then I'll add a link to our CSS. So CSS link. And this is again the link. And this is styles.css. And then we'll connect to our script within our body. So script source is equal to scripts.js. Done. So again, this is our bare bones boilerplate that we have added. Now, let's start with a free example. Let's start with an example where we don't want to read anything from the user. We just want to show something out, right? So let's go for random user API where we get some random data from there and we just want to display it on the screen. Okay. So what we can do is let us go to our script. because this is where we'll write our logic. And the logic is going to be using our fetch function. So let me just delete. Okay, let me write it from scratch, no problem. So fetch is a JavaScript method. It's a built-in method which is available to create or connect to API. Okay, so this is the JavaScript method which is available within JavaScript. There are two different ways to do it, but this is the preferred way. The other way is to use something called XML HTTP request. I'm not using this. You can experiment with it, but the better approach is using fetch. Okay. So what we have to do here is we have to provide the URL that we want to connect to. So in our case, it is going to be the random user API. So random user.me/API, that's our URL. Okay. This is the first thing. What this will do is when we write this fetch function, JavaScript is going to try to connect to this API in the backend. It will not show anything to us internally within the browser. Like the browser will send a request to this API and it will try to connect to that API. Okay. Then what we can do is we can attach a bunch of then methods. So JavaScript gives us access to something called then, which will be executed only after this is done. So what we are effectively trying to say is after you are able to connect to this API and get some response from there, what we want to do is we want to take that response that you have received and we want to convert that response into JSON format. So we can say response.json. Okay. So this is the second step. So what we're doing is we are saying fetch the data first. After you fetch the data, take the response that you have received. Now, this can be anything. You can call it whatever you want, like data.json, whatever it is. But typically, we use the term response. So the API is returning a response, and then we can finally do something with it. So again, we can attach another then, and then let us say that we go for, so we need the data, and then we can say console.log data. So what we're doing here is we're doing three steps, right? Step one, we are connecting to the API, trying to get the response. Once we get the response, we are converting the response to JSON. Converting the response to JavaScript from JSON. So this response.json is going to take the JSON data and convert it into a JavaScript object, something that JavaScript can understand. Now, if you were writing the same code in Python, then here we'll use a different function, something that will convert the code to Python from JSON to Python, right? So we'll write that. Okay, that's our setup. And then step three, we are taking that converted data, which has been converted to JavaScript now, and we are printing it in the console. We already know what console.log will do. It will just print it in the console. So now let us go ahead and try to run this. So let me pull up the console. And hopefully, if everything goes well, then you can see in the console, we have the data that has come from our API. And if I reload this, we can still see it should be a different piece of data, right? So this is in the results. And then here we have the name Alicia Pierre, right? Elisa Pierre. If I reload it, we should get a different piece of data. Let's check. So when I refresh, now we get a different data, Raquel Gallardo, right? So we have different pieces of data coming in, which means that our random user API connection is working fine. Now, we have this data available with us. So what we want to do is we want to now display it on the screen. How do we do this? Well, let us create a placeholder for it. So in HTML, let us say we add two things. We add an image, of that person. So that will be image source. It can be empty for now. And then we want to add a name of the person. Let's put H2. Now we can use our normal JavaScript, which we have already created. So this will be, for example, ID, let's say user image, right? And then this will be ID equal to user name. And we already know how to do this, right? We have already done this. So first of all, what we can do is we can read those things. So we can say variable user image is equal to document dot get element by ID user image. Okay, this is one. Then what we want to do is we want to read the user, this thing. So user name is equal to, again, document dot get element by ID user name. So we are reading those two things. Then we can set the value. So we can say user image dot set attribute source. We want to set the source to what value do we want? Well, that will come from our data. So where is this value available? It is available within our data inside results. So this is our data, right? Then inside that we have results. So that is going to be data dot results. Then results is an array. So to access the value within results, we have to put 0. Okay. So that will be the index 0, which is this 0, right? So we have mentioned that. And then within this, we have picture, and within that we have thumbnail. So we can then say dot picture dot thumbnail. Okay. Now this might not show up just yet. It will not show up just yet, right? Because I'll tell you why. The reason that this is not showing up is because this is happening instantly. See, whenever we want to fetch some data or whenever we want to connect to the backend, it is always a time consuming task, right? You can see the data is not showing up. Why? Because it is a time consuming task. It is always a time consuming task. So this setup that we have to do or this modification must happen within then. Okay. So in addition to or instead of just saying console.log, what we can do is we can print this out. We can run this entire functionality. And now you will see as soon as I do that, instantly the image shows up. I will refresh, another image will show up. I will refresh, another image will show up, right? Because what is happening is earlier what we were doing is after the data is already fetched, after that we were trying to set it, okay, which is still fine, but then the data must be global. So here what is happening is the data is local, right? And this will take 2 to 3 seconds. It can take some time. So while this is still happening, JavaScript will continue executing the rest of it. So by the time it reaches this line, it will not have the data that we want, which is why we have to move it to the to within inside this one, right? So we can create a separate function for it, but a better approach is we can just put it directly over here for now. We'll worry about creating a separate function for it later. Similarly, we can set the username. So we can say username dot inner HTML is equal to, and then data dot again results of 0 dot. I think there is a something called, let's check the response. Uh, name dot first. So we have dot name dot first. So this should hopefully then set the username as well. And now you can see we get the image along with the name, Marlis in this case. So again, every time you refresh, the details are changing. Okay. What we can also do is to make it a little more dynamic or to make it a little more real world-ish, we can add a loading indicator to this. So what we can do is we can say H1. Again, you can add whatever CSS you want. Okay. And I can just say ID is equal to loading. Now, before we print these out, okay, we can hide it. So what will happen is by default, loading will be visible. Loading is visible. As soon as the data is fetched, what we want to do is we want to hide that loading. So how can we hide it? Well, we can style it CSS, right? So just like this, we can read our loading. So document dot get element by ID loading. And then how do we change the CSS? Can somebody quickly type it in the chat? We want to hide the loading element from the screen. So can somebody quickly type that in the chat? How can we modify that loading? So Ganesh, attendance will happen at 9. The session is from 7 to 9, right? It's not a 1 hour session. You guys have attended sessions before. It's a 2 hour session. So before the session ends, like 8:45-ish, the attendance link will be shared. Okay. Yes, style.visibility. Perfect. Yes, Venkat, absolutely. So you can create an entire application without having your own backend, provided you use a third-party backend with APIs. Absolutely, you can do that. So yes, so what we can do is we can say loading dot style uh, dot display. is equal to none. We have several options here. We have visibility. Oh, I think this will be hidden. Display hidden, visibility none. We have several different options. So I think it will be none. Okay, you can see now this is more realistic. So loading shows up, and then when the data loads up, loading is gone, right? So this is what we were aiming for. Again, it's a very simple setup. I know it's a very basic example, but it gets the job done, right? So we connect to our API, we are getting some data from there, and we are replacing that data on the screen. Okay. If you want, you can have some dummy data here, but this is better, to load it dynamically. So loading shows up and then it disappears and data shows up. Now, of course, you can add whatever CSS you want to make it more interactive. You can maybe also, instead of manually reloading this, you know how to add a button, right? You know how to add event, like attach event. So what you can do is you can add a button here calling load new user. And when the user clicks on it, they will be able to reload data, fetch new user. So you know how to do this. We have seen how to handle events in the previous session. So I hope you will be able to do something like that as well, right? So that's our setup with APIs where we don't have to send any data, okay? Where we don't have to send any data. Yes. So now let me quickly explain the syntax to you once again. And for that, let me just hide this part. This is uh, a little, yeah. So this is our API syntax. This is everything that you need to connect in normal JavaScript. So fetch is the name of the function. This is the API. Fetch will automatically connect to the API in the background, right? So it will automatically connect to the API behind the scenes and try to get the response from it. The first then will only be triggered after it has received a response. So if the URL is incorrect, for example, let me also show you, let us say that we put a wrong URL. So here in the console, you will get error, unexpected token, not valid JSON. So you can see that the browser is trying to connect to this API and it is expecting a JSON response. So if the API returns a JSON response, then it goes to the next line. So then what we're doing here is we are saying take the JSON response that has been received from the API and convert it to a JavaScript object. Convert it to something that JavaScript can understand, right? So this is where JSON to JavaScript conversion is happening with this response.json. You can hover over it. You can check out the documentation to understand this in more detail. Okay, so this will tell you the exact same thing. It will read the request body and basically parse the text as JSON. So effectively, it is converting it from JSON to JavaScript. Then whatever else we have written will happen. So we are connecting to the API, getting the response, converting that response to JavaScript, and then whatever logic we want to apply will happen within the next then. Okay. So this is the code that we have written for our backend. If it is in XML, then we have similar options available for XML as well. Right? So you'll have to just find the corresponding XML method. For that, what we do is we don't use fetch. Fetch is used for JSON data. If you want to get XML data, then there is something called XML HTTP request. This is another ability that is available in JavaScript. So XML HTTP request is what you have to create first and then use that. So it's a slightly different syntax. You can refer to the documentation for more. Okay. There are two different ways. Fetch is used for JSON data and then XML HTTP request is used for the XML style API. And similarly, we have capabilities available for almost all other formats as well. Okay, perfect. Now, let us say that there is an API where we want to send some data. Okay, we want to send some data. There are two examples that I want to show you. Let's see if we have enough time for both. But I will just keep this commented. Okay, I'm not going to delete it. I'm just keeping it commented so that when you get the code file, you have access to it. So I will just write example one. Okay, and it is commented in the file. Okay, and now I will go for example two. So the next API that we are going to explore, again, this is a free API. This is provided by Google there's an API called Google Books. Okay, Google Books API. So this API basically provides us access to 10 books, whatever we search for. Okay. So we can provide the title of the book, author of the book, whatever it is. Based on the data that we provide, Google is going to give us 10 books from their database, like top 10. No matter how many, how many books are there, it is going to give us 10 books. I'll show you an example first. So here is the API. Now you have to create an account in some cases, like if you want to extract more details, etc. But for a normal query, we don't really have to create any account. Okay, so let me just try to find, yes, here is the one that I'm looking for. So let us say that we search for, okay, if you read, if any of you here reads, let me know a book that you're reading, your favorite book, something like that. Let's see if Google Books can help us find it. Just put it in the chat and I'll search for it. So if any of you read here, or whatever, let me know if you have a book in mind. Rich Dad Poor Dad. Okay. The Secret, interesting. Okay, so let's go for one of these. Let's go for the and then Secret. Okay, let's see what we get. So I'm just hitting the API, and you can see as soon as we hit the API, we get a lot of responses. Again, this is JSON. So if I enable my pretty print, you can see that total books with that name are 2,600 something, and it will return the top 10 in the items array, right? So again, the title is The Secret, Rhonda Byrne, who is the author. We also have the link of the book, right? We also have the other things, for example, book images, language, preview, etc., etc., right? So if I just go for, let's say, the book thumbnail, let me just copy the whole thing and let me just try to extract the thumbnail from it so we can see if it's the actual book or not. It will be the actual book, I'm pretty sure. So yes, you can see this is the thumbnail for the book. Perfect, right? So now what we want to do is, this is of course happening in the browser. What we want to do is we want this to be enabled on our page. So what we want is we want to have a form, right, where the user will type the name of the book and then they will click on a search button. As soon as they click on the search button, our API call will be triggered. We will connect to the books API and we will fetch the book details. So we'll show 10 books on the screen. That's what we want to do, right? So for this, let's discuss steps. So step one, read user input. Okay, so that's naturally step one. Then after we read the input, step two is going to be trigger event, right? API call or trigger API event. So this is where we want to detect the search button click when they click on the search button. And then we want to fetch API data. So this is our backend. And then we want to display book list. There are four steps. I hope there is no confusion in this, right? I hope this makes absolute sense. No confusion. So which HTML element will let us read data from the user? Now, we don't necessarily have to create a form here. It can be a single input field as well, right? So input fields allow us to read data from the user. So we can say input type equal to text, ID is equal to book title. Okay. Again, we need ID because we want to read it in the backend. Then we can have a button. Let's say button ID is equal to fetch books. Okay. And then this is search. So very, very basic input. I am not really interested in the front end right now. We are really interested in the in the functionality, right? So we have created a very basic front end. We can just type something here and search. Now, step one is done, right? Any questions in this? I hope not, but let me know if it is clear so far. So is step one clear? Again, just put a yes, clear, understood, something in the chat. So I know it's clear. Perfect. Okay, great. So now let's go to step two. So that's trigger the API event. This is going to happen in our backend, right? Not in the front end. And for this, we'll create a function. Let's call it fetch books. So this can be a function. And within the function, what is the first thing that we want to do? Well, we want to first read the data that the user has entered. So that is going to be our book title. This is going to be again document.get element by ID book title dot value. Remember, we have already discussed this. If it's an input field, we can get the input data by using the value attribute or the value property. So from the book title, we are extracting the value, right? Then the next thing is we want to write our API logic. So that's going to be fetch, right? And then let me get the Google Books API. This is our API. We have to work on it. Okay. Then the response part will stay the same. So we have the response.json. This will stay the same. And then the other part will change. So this then data. And again, for now, let me just log it. So console.log data. Okay, just trying to get the basic syntax in place. Okay, done. So we are going to Google Books and let's search for a particular book. Let's say The Plus Secret. Okay. And then we are trying to fetch some response, right? This makes sense. Okay. Let me run this and see what we get. So let's head over to a browser. Let's go for inspect and console and let me type something in. So obviously it's not going to work because there are three problems here. So nothing is happening on search. Okay, why? Can you tell me what is wrong? Why is the search not working yet? So far what we have done is we have created our front end. That's just three things: an input button, a input field, a search button, and a line underneath it. And then we have just written the exact same code that we had written earlier. Fetch, URL, then convert response, then display data. There is nothing else that we have written so far. So can anybody point out why the search is not working yet? I'll keep the code side by side. Perfect. On click is missing. Exactly. So we have created the button, but we have not triggered the function yet. Right? Remember, we have to write on click and then we have to write the function call. Right? So on click, we want to invoke fetch books. So I'm going to do this. Now, if I go ahead and search for it, okay, hopefully fetch books gets run and we get our data. As you can see here, we have all our book data, 10 books, 0 through 9, and we have data for each book. Okay. So we have successfully fetched the data from the API. But no matter what we search, it is always going to be the same book, right? Because we have not really passed the user data here. So how can we replace this or what can we do such that the user's data, which is this book title, that can be searched? Right now, we are not searching for book title. We are always searching for the secret. It is hard coded, right? So what can we do here to integrate the user's book title? We have also seen this as well in a previous session. I have already shown you what the solution to this is, but I still want you to think about it. What can we do here so that we can dynamically attach the user's response, user's form data to this query, to this API call? Any suggestions, any thoughts? Okay, it's very simple, right? We just have to connect the user query. So we can just say Q is equal to plus the book title. That's it, right? We are already reading the book title from the user. All we need to do is attach the book title at the end of our query. So we can directly just say plus book title. This is one way. You can also use the other way, which is this dollar syntax, right? Which is going to enable you to put like this one. But again, this is the best approach. We can just use concatenation. We can just use string concatenation, and that should do it. Now, Let us try this out. So let's go for, again, I'm going for a very cliched search. I'm searching for Harry Potter. I will search and you can see, first of all, the item count is different. That's 12.99 now. And if I pick up the first book, okay, so Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. Perfect. This is Harry Potter. Let's check another book. Um, okay, Urdu language edition. Interesting. Uh, let me just, I'm just trying to see if we have all books. I mean, obviously all books will be similar, but I'm just trying to check. Yes, the psychology of Harry Potter. Perfect. So all our books are now Harry Potter. Let's change it. Let's go for another classic series, that's Narnia, and search for it. So now our results should change. Total items have changed and we should get something like Chronicles of Narnia, which is perfect. The complete Chronicles of Narnia, right? So now depending on the user data, depending on the user's query, we are able to fetch the exact books that are needed. Let's move to the next step. So what is the next step? Well, fetch API data. This is done. So we are done with step 2 and 3. The final step is to display the book list. Now, this is where we are going to face a little bit of a trouble. So how can we do this? Well, let's add a list. So I'm adding a div, okay, a container, and this will be ID equal to books. Then within this, we want to show, let's keep it very simple. We just want to show all book images. Just that. We are not worried about other things. Of course, you can expand on this later. But for now, we just want to show all book images. So how can we create a custom element over here? You can let me know in the chat. How can we create a custom image element? What will be the code for it? How can we set its source? So these two lines of code are a challenge for you. And then I'll append it to the div. So can somebody, uh, so try to give me the entire query, entire code. Okay. The code is create an image element. And the second step is to add a dynamic source attribute. These two things. So tell me how to do these two steps, and then I'll type it out over here. Okay. So document dot create element. Okay. So obviously we have to first give it a variable also. Let us say book image is equal to document dot create element image, comma, image. That's it. That should do it. And then we have already done this up top. Not sure if you guys are paying attention to the session or not, but I have already told you how to set the attribute. Like just now, 10 minutes ago, we have done this. Not really sure what is wrong, but yes. So what we have to do is we have to modify this line here. Okay. And then we can say book image dot set attribute. We want to set the source attribute, right? And then what will be the attribute? Now, this is where it gets difficult for us. So we have 10 books. Okay, we have 10 books. We can extract data from one. Okay, so okay, let's do this. We can say data dot results of 0. There is something called items. Okay, okay, not results. This is data dot items in this case. So data dot items. And then we are saying, okay, take the first book from the list. Um, Let me just get rid of the error, search for it just to see the data. Okay, we have removed the console log. Fair enough. So let's check the response here. Okay, so within items, right? Items, and then items, inside that we have image links and then thumbnail. Okay, so dot image links, dot thumbnail. Okay, this should do it. All right, perfect. Let's go for it. So let's go ahead and search for something. So the secret and search, and okay, cannot read properties of undefined thumbnail. I think there's a spelling mistake, probably. So data is the response, right? Data. And then data dot items will be this array of 0 is the first book. Within that, Uh, is it inside volume info? Yes, it's inside volume info. All right, so let's add one more level. Dot volume info dot image links dot thumbnail. All right, let's search for it again. Okay, it is working, but we have forgot to append it. Right, we are setting this attribute, but we have not appended it yet. So to append it, we can say books is equal to, again, we have done this so many times now, document dot get element by ID, books. This is the div which contains all books. And then after this set attribute, we can say books dot append child. And then we want to append our book image. So this is going to be our append. Now, if I search for it, hopefully one book will show up. As you can see, the first book shows up. Okay. But this is not everything that we want. We have 10 books. We want to show 10 books, but we are only showing one. So what can we do to modify this so that we are able to do this for 10 books? Right? So for this, JavaScript gives us a bunch of different options actually, but we have a very interesting function called a map function. I'm going to show it to you now. There's a very interesting function called a map function. Okay. So what the map function will do is, if we have an array, which is what we have in the case of data. So assume that this is our array of 10 books, right? So what the map will do is it will take the identity of one book at a time, starting from the first book all the way to the last book. Okay. So it is going to automatically run through the array, run through all 10 books and perform the task that we tell it to do. Okay. So this is what it looks like. We can say data dot items dot map. Items is the array. Data is not the array, right? If you check the output, items is where we have the books. This items, this is square brackets. So this is an array. So we can say data dot items dot map. And then what do we map? Well, we have to do the same task that we were doing. So map looks like this. Within map, we create our own function like this, right? And then we write all our logic uh, over here. Okay, so we can say whatever logic we want to perform, that will go over here inside our map function. Okay. So this is what that will look like. And then we want to do this for every book. So what do we want to do is, for each book, we are now going to repeat. Okay. So for each book, we want to create the book image, set attribute, and then append it. So we have modified this slightly, right? We have modified this slightly, and this will change to book. Okay, let me just check if everything is good. So we are creating a new element. We are setting this attribute and we are appending it. Looks good. Let's see if it works, and then I'll walk you through the code once again. So I'm going to search for it. And there you go. It is creating 10 books for us. Okay. So again, if I search for any other book, for instance, instead of just giving us one cover, one result, now it is giving us 10 results. Now, obviously, I'm not saying this is the most optimal way or the most efficient way to get this done, but we typically use map in such situations. Now, let's take a look at the code in more detail to understand what exactly is going on here. So I hope this code is fine. We have fetch, then we are converting the response to JavaScript. This much should be fine. Then we are getting that JavaScript object. Now within that, this is the new logic that we have written. So what we are doing is, first of all, we are using a function called map. Map is a special function, just like fetch is available in JavaScript. We have something called map that is also provided by JavaScript. The map function is going to go through every element in that array. So in this case, we have 10 books. So what the map is going to do is, it is going to go through each book one by one. So effectively, it is going to run 10 times. Instead of running just once, like what we had before map, this is going to repeat this code 10 times, once for each book. Okay. Now, what is this going to do? Well, the first thing that it is going to do is it is creating a new image tag. Then it is setting its attribute. Okay. Setting the image source. And then it is appending that to the book div, books div. Okay. These three lines of code will be repeated for the number of times that many books are there. So in this case, there are 10 books. So these three lines are going to be repeated 10 times, which means for each book, a new tag will get created. For each book, a new source will be set, and each book will be appended to the div, which is why one by one, we get 10 books on the screen. Okay. Is this clear? Does this make sense? Right. Now, this book that is inside the map, this is going to be our access to every value that map is taking, which is why over here, instead of having the initial, which we had, data dot items of 0, I have replaced it with book. So it is going to give us access to every data item, every book that it is going to run through one by one. So we are extracting the volume info from that book. So for each book, we are extracting the thumbnail. Okay. So this book is basically just like, every time it will go through different book. There are 10 books. It will start from book 1, book 2, book 3. So whenever it changes a book, we can access that data available using this variable. So this book will be first book in the first run, second book in the second run, third book in the third run, so on till it reaches the 10th book in the 10th repetition. Okay. So this is a very important function. You will see this a lot. Map is very extensively used whenever we want to display more than one items like this. Now, of course, what we can do is we can make this more complicated. We can add, say, name of the book, author name. We can add CSS styles and all of that to it, which is for you to work on. I just wanted to show you the API part, right? So I have shown you two examples, two very different examples. The first example is where we had nothing to do with the user. We were just showing some data fetched from the API. The second example is much more complicated, where we are actually reading something from the user. We are passing that data to the API, and then we are fetching the data from the API, and we are displaying it on the screen. This is a complete request response cycle. It's a complete front end back end cycle, right? The user is providing you input. You are sending that input to API, getting the result from API, showing it to the user. These are 4 steps, right? Take user data, send to API, get API response, show to user. So in the second example, we have implemented all 4 steps, right? So these two code pieces are going to be very important for you. Make sure you always keep them with you, right? Of course, they will be available on the repository, but make sure you always keep these with you, because this is going to be really helpful for you in the longer run, right? So fetch is a very important function, and map is also very important. So both the functions that we have seen today are super important when it comes to real world applications, right? We always make API calls with fetch, it's a very common function. And again, mostly if you think of any real world data, it will always be multiple items being returned, right? Product list, movie list, order history, transaction history. In all of these cases, you will get more than one item. So to display that on the screen, we are going to use map, right? So that's a very important function as well, right? So make sure you remember both of these. It's a very important session today, and the code that we have written is going to be extremely important, along with obviously the concept of an API. That's very important as well. So this was a very important session. I hope you were paying attention. Of course, I will provide you the code, but yeah, it's going to be really important for you to remember this. Now, the final thing that I want to quickly just mention, we are not going to implement it, but there is a possibility that some APIs might want you to provide data in a different way. For example, this API accepted data as a query, right? So we had this queue parameter and we were able to provide data like that. Most APIs will ask you for your API key in something like this. They will say API underscore key in the URL itself. That's how most APIs will work. So you just have to copy the URL, replace the data dynamically, and done. But in some cases, there might be an API which asks you to send data in header. Okay, so there is a very the use case is limited. Most APIs work in the previous way, but there is an optional setup that we can provide in these curly brackets. Okay, so after the URL, which is the first argument or the first parameter, we can provide some additional details over here, like headers, for example, right? So headers is an object which again looks like this or works like this. So what we can do is we can create some data. For example, in some cases, you might have to provide the key like this, my key. Okay. In some cases, some APIs might ask you to provide data in this format. Okay, very simple. Instead of just adding the data to the URL, they might ask you to send data like this in a header. So to create the header, you just have to put curly brackets and then create the headers object like this. Okay. I will keep this also in the code file just in case you want to refer to it. If you face any syntax errors, you can always, you can always go ahead and connect, like check the documentation. Today's topic is API. You can mention the topic as API, Application Programming Interface. That is the topic of the session for today. Right. So for everybody who's asking for the topic, this is our topic. Okay, perfect. So now I'm open for questions. So if you have any doubts or questions, please put them in the chat. And in the meanwhile, I'm just taking a quick minute to update this in the repository as well. So let me just go ahead and quickly do that right away, so that you also have access to it. And in the meanwhile, the team will also provide the attendance link in just a minute. But yes, so if you have any doubts or questions, do let me know. You can just put them in the chat now. So I will keep, in every session, I'll try to keep the last 15 to 20 minutes for doubts, because as and when we keep discussing more concepts, you will keep getting more doubts, because the more difficult the concepts get, I know that, the more confusing they get, the more questions you might have. So I'll keep the last 15-20 minutes for doubts always. All right, so the repository has been updated. I will give you the link again in the chat. Please make sure you have the link. I am sure all of you have it already. But if you don't have it yet, I am pasting it in the chat now. Please take it from there. Okay. So again, I have updated the code. The recording will be updated as soon as it becomes available. But I have added session 5 also and session 6 also. Session 6 contains today's code, which is our API code, right? So this is our API code. And session 5 contains the previous session's code, which is where we discuss event handling and all of that. Okay. So that also sums up our JavaScript discussion. And we'll now be moving to Python in the next couple of sessions, right? So we have had 3-4 sessions on JavaScript now, and we'll slowly make our way to Python next, right? So that's something for you to just know, just keep an eye out. So the next couple of sessions are going to be, Python based. And then of course, we'll put them all together in the project. So there I'll show you how to do the full front end, back end database, everything put together integration once we get to the last couple of sessions. Yes, now I'm going to read the questions one by one. What is the difference between JavaScript and Node.js? So Charan, JavaScript is a programming language and Node.js is a framework, which is a particular way of building backend applications, which uses JavaScript as a language. So Node.js will show you how to build your own servers using JavaScript. So it's more of a step-by-step guide. You are still writing the code in JavaScript, but Node.js is more of a step-by-step guide to building backend apps. So that's what that is. And okay, what permissions are granted by API keys? So, Pawan, it depends on the API. The question that you have asked, is very subjective to the API. If the API, I haven't seen a lot of APIs where you have like levels of access, because typically it's implemented on your end and you would restrict access. The API would just provide all the data. But sure, I mean, the API key could decide what kind of data you can access. The API key will also decide if it's a restricted access in terms of the number of fetches. So, for example, in Google Maps API, what happens is the first $200 worth of data is fetched for free. So let us assume, so there are different ways of calculating the cost. I'm not going into that, but let us assume, that I want to check the distance of my place to your place, and it is costing me $1, for example. So I can run 200 such requests for free. Once I hit that $200 quota, then it will start charging. So this track of how many requests have been made is kept using the API key, right? So similarly, some APIs will, restrict access. Some APIs will keep a count on the free quota. That depends on the API. So it's a very subjective question in that sense. It varies from API to API. Ishwar, you'll have to connect with the team for this. As of now, this is the only ongoing batch, which will end next month. And then maybe the next batch will start. I'm not sure. But yes, so for now, there's only one batch per domain, right? So FSD one batch is going on, AIML one batch is going on, ChatGPT one batch is going on. Similarly, each batch, like one batch for every domain is currently running. Right. So that's what I know. If you want more details, please reach out to the team directly. Where can I deploy a Flask-based web project for free? So Hemant, you can explore this platform called Netlify that should allow you to deploy it for free. So I'm giving you the name in the chat. Netlify, Netlify. There is also something called Render, that's onrender.com. So I'm giving you that name in the chat as well. These are two options, Netlify and Render. They are two platforms that you can explore. Uh, Yes, API keys do expire, definitely. So most keys have a 30-day quota. I mean, most keys are valid for 30 days. So it's like every month you have to modify your key. That is kept in place, for security purposes also. And, to also make sure that the billing is done in that way. So they bill one key for 30 days and then the next key is billed for the next 30 days. So in most cases, the API keys expire in about 30 days or so. There are some places where you get a 90-day key, maybe a year-long key. But yes, they do expire in some APIs, definitely. Sure. So what we've discussed today are three things. Number one, we have talked about the general concepts of an API. So we have understood how front-end and back-end communication happens, or how different, programs or applications talk to each other with the help of an API. So we have seen the theoretical understanding. Then we have explored the JSON data format, that's JavaScript object notation. So I've given you examples of JSON data. We have worked with JSON data as well. And then the third is we have seen two examples of working with actual APIs. So I've given you two examples, one where we just fetch data, the second where we send something to the API and based on that we get some response. Right? So that's what we have covered today in a nutshell. Okay. Right. Okay, I've explained it once again. So for everybody who's repeating that, I will not repeat this once again. What are the main differences between API and web service? It's very similar again. So, web services are also implementing APIs behind the scenes. It's just that they are mostly for business use cases, whereas APIs are for more user interaction use cases. So, for example, like Razorpay or these payment gateways and all, where you have to send OTP and all that stuff, that is typically done with web services, as opposed to APIs, which are more user driven. So users will initiate API calls in most cases, but again, the job that they do is very similar. Again, so if you're facing LMS issues, please reach out to the support team. I really can't help with any LMS as such. So yeah, maybe reach out to the support team. Regarding the front-end projects, again, we are giving you assessments. So I hope you have finished both assessments I have been making them myself. The third assessment is also ready for you. It will be shared with you soon this week. So be ready for a little more difficult challenge, which will be API based. That's going to be your third API, right? So that's the idea. A third assessment, which will be based on something like what we have done today, where you have to send something to an API and get some response from there. So that's the third assessment. Will be shared later this week. Sure. So if you want to do a mini front-end project, a really good example is in try creating a restaurant menu project, something like that, where you show different dishes in a restaurant and the user is able to filter them out based on categories. Like maybe add a veg, non-veg filter, maybe add Chinese, Indian cuisine filters, or maybe add category filters like rice, main course, starters, something like that. So start by displaying all dishes. Let us say there are 20 dishes. So start by displaying all 20 dishes and then give filters to the user so they can click on veg button. So only veg dishes will be filtered out. They can click on starters. Only starters will be filtered out. Try making this as a mini front end project. Shravani, the team will take about 2 to 3 days to respond. So if you have reached out over the weekend, please give them another day or so. They will get back to you. Don't worry. It's just that it could take, since it was the weekend and even today there is Eid, so there was a holiday. That's why there could have been a delay in the response. Just give them another day or so. They will get back to you. So we can't, I mean, Pawan, we can create an internal tracker definitely, but more importantly, I mean, what you can do is you can simply just store all your API requests in the database. So you can just count that and you can see how many, API calls have been made. But that is basically how the API companies work. They will track the amount of requests coming in based on your key, and that's how the billing will be done. So yes, they definitely, do that. We will get back to the to-do list soon. So that's for another session. We will work on the edit, update, delete as well. That's coming up in another session soon. No, please submit code files. So Venkata Suresh, I don't want your Word document. I will run the code myself. I want the code files. So please submit your HTML, CSS, JavaScript files in the assignment. I don't need you to copy paste the code, show me outputs, not needed. I can run the code and see the output for myself. So yes, I would want the code files. Just the code files will do. Okay, perfect. I think those are all the questions from the chat. Uh, if you don't have a laptop, there is nothing we can do, to be very honest. Vamsi Krishna, maybe try to get it from a friend for some time. Try to get it for an hour a day or something so that you can practice. But there is no way to code on a phone or anything like that. So no other option. That's why in the very first session, I was very clear on, that you need a laptop. Okay. So the internship duration is about 3 months, wherein the sessions will be for about 30 hours. So we have 15 sessions in total. We are done with 6 sessions now. So about 2 weeks more, 2 to 3 weeks more, we have sessions, and then you will have your placement, the exams and all of those project exams and all later on. Okay. Perfect. So that's pretty much it for today then. Thank you so much, guys, for attending. I hope I was able to answer most of the questions, if not all. But yes, so I'll keep the last 15-20 minutes every day for questions. So that way, we'll be able to take up more questions. Uh, so yes, that's it for this one. Thank you so much, guys, for attending. I hope you have understood the concepts well. And yeah, let's continue our discussion in the next one. So the next session is as planned, Wednesday, 5 to 7. If there is any change in the timings like it was today, it will be informed to you. So again, today's session was not changed by me. It was because of the Zoom account not being available. There was another change that happened because of which we did not have a Zoom account available for 5 to 7. So we change it from 7 to 9. So if anything like that changes, you will be informed by the team. But as of now, it is 5 to 7 on Wednesday. That's when the next session is going to be. All right. Perfect. Thank you so much for attending. I hope this makes sense. Have a great day. See you guys in the next one. Bye bye.